Currently, in the state of South Carolina, your neighborhood is the primary deciding factor on your access to quality education. Funding for school districts is largely based on the tax revenue for that service zone. So what does that mean? If you live in an economically disadvantaged area where commerce is faltering, your schools have access to fewer funds for their students and the achievement gap continues to widen. Oftentimes, kids in these districts are from marginalized groups, racially and even vocationally, for example, farmers and other blue-collar jobs. Ideally, these issues would have resolved themselves in 1954 when the Supreme Court decided on the case of Brown v. Board of Education. They decided, "We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal." According to the Supreme Court, every student in the United States was supposed to have the same access to a quality education. But states have found new ways to cater towards their rich constituents. Much like the gerrymandering of voting districts, school district lines and even school zones are specifically drawn to funnel kids into the schools that make those in power more comfortable. In the meantime, some of our most vulnerable children, those who live in extreme poverty and other marginalized groups, are being deprived of the resources they need. It's a case of the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, both financially and educationally. More expensive houses and big businesses equate to certain school zones having access to more funding for their students. Let's look at two specific school districts, Kershaw County School District and Richland School District 2. Geographically, these two school districts border one another, but fiscally, they look very different. The local tax revenue for each illustrates the disparity between the districts. While Kershaw County Schools covers 740 square miles of the state and services just under 11,000 students, Richland County Schools covers only 157 square miles, but services just over 28,000 students. However, fiscally, Kershaw brought in only $27 million in taxes, whereas Richland 2 brought in over $117 million. But these numbers don't tell the story of the kids in my classroom in the most rural part of Kershaw County. As a former teacher at one of the high schools, I saw students who lived in a level of poverty that was incomprehensible to me. Trailers with no heat or running water and holes in their floors. Kids who often shared their parents' inability to read beyond the most basic levels. Children who had never been to the state zoo, even though it's less than an hour away, simply because they couldn't afford it. They don't have the prior schema and experience that is sometimes required on standardized tests. Many of the kids at my school were raised on farms and in towns without a stoplight, where the largest commerce was from a small lumber factory on the periphery of the town. The school had holes in the floor, outdated technology, and a distinct lack of diversity in the available literature. But our kids couldn't afford to supplement with their own technology or books, and subsequently, their test scores were often not where the state deemed acceptable. It's a vicious cycle perpetrated against impoverished students. Kids who are already starting at a disadvantage are given subpar resources, and then they're blamed when they fail to hit the same performance marks that their wealthier peers hit. However, in the case of North Central, the teachers made up where the state lacked. Our school's poverty rate was approaching 90% when I first started working there in 2009, but it has since declined to 62%. These students needed and deserved the best our Department of Education had to offer. And even though the teachers certainly did their best with the resources made available to them, the kids need better funding to make up for the lack of tax base and/or parent organizations that can help. But still, the school managed to raise its state ranking from below average to good, even outscoring Spring Valley High School by 1 point on the 2022 school report card. Ultimately, it comes down to this. Why are the kids of North Central less deserving of state funds just because their parents live in a rural part of the state, and many of whom don't make above minimum wage? Federal funding makes up for some of the differences in state funding, But economically disadvantaged students should not have to rely on the federal government to take care of them when the state fails to do so. So what's the solution? How do we solve this inequity among our schools while not having to rely on the federal government? All of the taxes gathered for educational purposes in the state of South Carolina could go into one account and then divvied up to districts on a per-pupil basis. Therefore, all students in the state would have access to the same amount of funding. We also shouldn't be largely basing the school and district report cards on hitting a certain score on a test. We should be considering growth. Let's see where the kids are starting and then see where the teachers can get them from there. Our schools have continued to be segregated, albeit now it has more to do with income and geography in South Carolina. Students don't get to choose where they live, but we are punishing them all the same. We are failing the kids who need us the most, but there are ways to fix this broken cycle if we're only willing to balance the scales.